Okay, today's video lecture covers the topic of evolution. Today we're going to cover the basic definition and a description of the major components that are necessary in order for evolution to occur. I'm going to ask you all to take some notes today in your notebook, so you should have your notebook with you. If you don't have your notebook with you, please take the notes on a separate piece of paper that you can tape in later. This is how the notes page should be set up. It's sort of a Cornell note style, giving it a page number, topic, notes on evolution, and then these three components arranged down the left-hand margin with a divider. You will take your notes in this region. You're going to begin by defining evolution, then list the components of evolution, and then give me a description of each of those components. And this is what I would like to see in class following this video lecture. Evolution, we should start with a definition of evolution. Evolution is defined as genetic change in a population of organisms over time. So evolution occurs whenever there is a change in the frequency of certain kinds of genes that cause certain traits, and it occurs over a period of time. This is an example. This picture is an example of something called adaptive radiation. This was something described by Charles Darwin, who was the first one to explain a process that allows evolution to occur. And he noticed that in finches, which these are all pictures of the heads of different kinds of finches, that they are all built on the same basic body plan, but based upon the kind of environment that they live in, certain populations might tend to have a beak that was specialized for doing the different things. This bird's beak is specialized for catching grubs, and this bird's beak is specialized for using tools to catch insects out of holes in trees. This bird's beak is specialized for collecting leaves. So, though they are all members of the same group, there has been genetic change in different populations based upon where they live and what they eat. And that genetic change has led to physical traits, so trait differences, and changes in those traits cause the organisms to look different. So how does this happen? And I prefer to think about evolution as an equation. I think it makes it easier to understand kind of the things that are necessary to occur. So this is the evolution equation. Evolution has three components. When genetic variation occurs, and selection occurs, and time passes, it leads to evolution. So evolution requires these three components. So in your notes where you're writing down the three components of evolution, they are genetic variation, selection, and time. And I'm going to go through each component in a little bit more detail right now. The first component is genetic variation. So before organisms can undergo evolution, there has to be variation in the traits of the organism. And since you know, after our last unit on protein synthesis, that traits are created as a result of transcription and translation using the information in DNA, a variation in traits must also mean there's a variation in the DNA of those organisms, the genetic material. Imagine this is a box with insects inside of it, and let's say they're all the same kind of insect. However, we have different variations. We have pink and black variations, and that would just be the result of different genes. Some produce pink, some produce black. You know, this could be a box full of people with brown hair and blonde hair, or anything that has variation. But variation must exist in the first place, and we'll talk more about that later. The second part or characteristic of the variation must be that it has to be inheritable. So it has to be a DNA difference. For instance, here are two pictures of variations. Here is variation in eye color, and here's a variation in the development of muscles in an adult male. Looking at these pictures, one of these would be genetic variation and one would not. Can you tell the difference? I hope you chose this as an example of genetic variation because it's inheritable. It's from the DNA. This is not a genetic variation. This is variation, but it's variation created by the environment and the weights that this individual lifted or the drugs that they used to help them develop those muscles. The second component is selection. And again, we have that box. We have our kind of imaginary pink and black dots, our two variations of dot style. Selection refers to anything in the environment of an organism that will select, that will pick certain varieties to reproduce and pass on their DNA. This is the driver of evolution, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about one kind of selection. It's the kind of selection that Darwin proposed called natural selection. Now, you must understand, or I want you to understand, that natural selection is one type of selection, but it is only one type. There are many other forms of selection as well. But the primary one for animals is likely natural selection. And selection refers to picking. So if this was our group of organisms and certain individuals were selected to reproduce in the next generation, and this box down here represented the second generation, and let's say for some reason, maybe they could get more food or maybe they were better fit, let's say the environment selected more of these black insects to reproduce. All of a sudden there's been a change in the population. We went from having more pink than black varieties to having more black than pink varieties. That represents a genetic change as a result of selection. Now in this case I did the selection, but for most animals the thing that does the selection is the environment. The last component is time. Because it takes many generations for genes to become more common, evolution takes time. Now, in that example before, I did it very quickly. I selected. But I hope you realize that in real life would take a long period of time. It would take just one generation, the amount of time that it takes for the adults to mature, reproduce, and have offspring of their own. And for every animal or plant, that's different. So in the case of a common fruit fly, one generation can be 2 weeks. In the case of an elephant, one generation takes 10 or 15 years. So think of this as a challenge question. Thinking of that last component of evolution. If you were going to do research on evolution, which organism would you choose? Would you choose an elephant or would you choose a fruit fly? And can you explain why in terms of the evolution equation? So think about that for a minute, pause the video, and then I will give you the answer. A good answer to this question of which subject we should choose would be that it would be preferable to choose the fruit fly. If the components of evolution are genetic variation, selection, and time, both of these individuals would be expected to have, or both of these species would be expected to have genetic variation. You know, some would have red eyes and some would have black, some would have longer tusks than others. You know, there would be variation. There could be some selecting factor in the environment that prefers one color eye or one length of tusk. And so the only component left to consider, since they are both equal in those senses, would be time. This one, you would get a new generation and you would be able to see whether the genes had changed over time within 2 weeks. This one would require 10 or 15 years in order to see whether the genes had changed and whether the population itself had changed. Populations of fruit flies change over every 2 weeks. You'll get much more data and occurs in a much shorter period of time, and you can learn more about evolution by studying a fruit fly than you can by studying an elephant. If it would take 10 or 15 years for every generation to occur, you would get very little data in your lifetime if elephants were your primary subject. And that concludes the first video lecture on the introduction to evolution.